Today I'd like to explore a question that came up in one of my satsangs recently when someone asked whether pure consciousness, the self spoken about in Advaita Vedanta and non-duality, is the same as the soul. It's a really interesting question and one that's definitely worth investigating, because inquiring into it can help us to understand more about our experience of individuality. It can shed light on the phenomenon of near-death experiences and reincarnation, and most importantly, it can allow us to get really clear about the nature of reality and the purpose of the spiritual path. And I'll be touching on all of those things in this video. So for those who don't know me, I'm Catherine, and having lived in an ashram in the Himalayas for 15 years, on this channel I share some of the deepest spiritual teachings in a clear and accessible way. And I also send out a short weekly philosophical email, and I'll link to that in the description box below. So the very short answer to the question I started with is no. In Sanskrit, the one indivisible pure consciousness, the self, is called the Ātman, whereas the thing that's closest to the idea of an individual soul, as it's spoken about in Abrahamic religions like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, in Sanskrit is called the Jiva or the Jīvatma. But to fully understand the difference between them, let's start with the basics of what creates our sense of existing as an individual entity. So we can begin with the part that's easiest to understand, the physical body. In Sanskrit, it's called the Sthula Sharira, or the gross body. It's made of and sustained by physical matter, which we call food. It grows from being a single cell, too small for the eye to see, to our full adult body size. It's constantly changing, and when it dies, it returns to the elements it was made of. This gross physical body is also called the Annamaya kosha, or the food body in the Upanishads. But this gross body is only the visible aspect of the human being, and it's animated by what's known as the subtle body, or the Sukshma Sharira. The subtle body allows us to experience ourselves as an individual. It includes pran, the life force that animates all systems within the body, the five senses through which we perceive the physical body and physical world, and the organs of action through which we speak and act and interact with the world. The subtle body also includes the mind, where thoughts, emotions, memories, and doubts arise, and the intellect through which we discriminate, understand, and make decisions. In the framework of the 5 kośas, which I've actually also made a video about, I'll link to that below as well, this subtle body is the equivalent of the pranamaya kosha, the layer or sheath associated with the pran or life force, the manomaya kosha, the sheath associated with the mind, and the vijnanamaya kosha, the sheath associated with the intellect. Then, on an even subtler level, there's the karana sharira, the causal body. This one is perhaps the most difficult of the 3 for the mind to understand, because it isn't active or even experienced in a way that can be perceived. Rather, it's a kind of seed state from which the subtle body and then the gross body emerges. It contains our deepest latent tendencies, the impressions that haven't yet manifested, and what Advaita calls avidya, ignorance of our true nature. It's commonly associated with Anandamaya kosha, the bliss body, the subtlest of the 5 sheaths, and also with the state of deep, dreamless sleep where the mind is absent, but ignorance still remains. So to summarize again, we have these 3 bodies. The gross body corresponding to Annamaya kosha, the subtle body corresponding to Pranamaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya kosha, and the causal body associated with Anandamaya kosha. And by the way, when you're thinking about these bodies, you don't have to believe that there are separate invisible objects hidden inside the body. You might find it more helpful to think of this system of different bodies or different layers simply as a framework that helps us to understand our experience by distinguishing different aspects of what we ordinarily call me. So now let's come back to the question of the soul. When most people use the word soul, they mean a part of us that survives death and yet still contains some essence or element of individuality. And as I said, in Advaita, the closest equivalent to that isn't the self, but what's known as the jīva, said to be the subtle body and causal body combined. However, it's really important to understand that the jīva doesn't exist as an entity separate from pure consciousness, the self. The jīva is the apparent individual that arises when pure consciousness is reflected in the subtle body. And because of the ego mechanism, ahankar, this body-mind is mistakenly taken to be me, myself. In other words, the jīva is the self appearing to be a separate individual through identification with the gross, subtle, and causal bodies. And because of that identification, pure consciousness seems to become a particular person with a history, personality, preferences, and so on. It appears to take birth through a particular physical body, to live through that body, and to eventually leave it behind. But the thing is that at this so-called death, the gross body falls away, but the subtle and causal aspects continue. The subtle body continues to be an instrument of experience, while the causal body contains the latent tendencies and karma which gives rise to future experience and to the apparent continuity of the jīva, which continues from one lifetime to another. Understanding the subtle body in this way can help us make sense of the reports of near-death experiences as well. The physical body may have become temporarily non-functional, but if the subtle body hasn't yet permanently separated from it, then experience can still continue. In just the same way, the subtle body has all sorts of experiences in our dreams at night, which involve subtle versions of hearing, seeing, feeling, etc., which our physical senses aren't involved with. This doesn't mean that near-death experiences are completely imaginary in quite the same way that we consider most of our dreams to be. They may still be considered true at the level at which they're being experienced. It's just that they are still experiences occurring within the subtle body. And then, of course, when the subtle body reconnects with the physical body, there's a vehicle through which to recall and to speak about them. And yet we should remember that these kinds of near-death experiences are witnessed by the same unchanging awareness that witnesses the waking and dream states of consciousness. But at the point of death, the subtle body only very rarely reconnects to the physical body in this way. Usually the subtle and causal bodies continue together. As I said, the causal body is called that because it contains the seed causes, the latent tendencies, the ignorance, and the karma from which a future embodiment arises. You could think of it as being like a blueprint which holds a particular parcel of tendencies, desires, and karma, and influences the shape of the next incarnation in the same way that the seed of an oak tree contains the blueprint of the fully grown tree. But here we come to the most important question. If the jīva continues from one lifetime to another, what does this mean for you? Does it mean that what you truly are is an individual soul gradually evolving over many lifetimes? Many spiritual traditions would answer yes to that question. They'd say the soul learns, it matures, it gradually becomes purified, and eventually it reaches its destination, unity with the divine. And the teachings of Advaita don't completely dismiss that perspective. From the standpoint of the identified jīva, there is an apparent journey. The jīva appears to move from one lifetime to another, shaped by its previous actions and carrying with it the latent tendencies that haven't yet been exhausted. This apparent journey is what Indian philosophy calls sansar, the wheel of birth and death. And as long as we take ourselves to be the jīva, this teaching makes perfect sense. So Advaita doesn't deny the apparent journey of the Jiva. However, it says that your true nature is pure consciousness, the Ātman, the self, the unchanging witness. And so what you really are has never been confined to an individual Jiva, and in truth never involved with the wheel of samsara at all. Bodies are born, bodies die. The Jiva appears to move from one body to another, gathering experience over many lifetimes. But pure awareness, the self, simply illumines the entire process. It was never born into any body, and therefore it never needs to leave one. The Jiva appears to be a separate individual entity, but the self is eternally indivisible, whole, complete, pure existence. Krishna points us towards this in chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, when he describes what he calls the kshetra, the field, and the kshetragya, the knower of the field. His description of the field includes the physical body, the mind, the subtle body, the ego, and what he calls the unmanifest, which is the equivalent of the causal body. So the entire journey and identity of the Jiva belongs to what is called the field. But he says, know me as the knower in all the fields. And this is why Krishna's main teaching in the Gita is, come to me, abide with me, and be liberated. This me is the witness of all experience, because this is the true self, the true me, the real, everlasting, eternal me, the knower of all the millions of bodies or fields. This witness doesn't come and go with experience. It's the ever-present awareness in whose light all experience appears. And this understanding can completely transform what we mean by liberation. So it's easy to imagine liberation as the end of a very long journey. We might picture the soul gradually evolving over thousands of lifetimes until eventually it becomes free. But the teachings of Advaita are pointing to a truth that is far more radical. Liberation isn't the end of a journey. It's the recognition that what you truly are has never been the traveler. The wheel of birth and death belongs to the apparent Jiva, not to you, the self. This doesn't mean that the teachings of karma and rebirth aren't sometimes useful. As long as we experience ourselves as separate individuals, those teachings can encourage us to live wisely, to purify the mind, to reduce suffering, to prepare the mind for self-knowledge. But the purpose of that preparation isn't so that the Jiva eventually becomes united with the self. The purpose is to recognize that the Jiva has, in fact, never been separate from the self. It is just an appearance of separation arising in the self. So sometimes people assume that the spiritual path is a process of personal evolution. And from one perspective, the perspective of the Jiva, it can certainly appear that way. Over time, wisdom grows, the personality can seem to become more peaceful, more patient, less reactive. But those changes belong to the Jiva. The purpose of the spiritual path isn't to improve the person, but to discover the reality in whose presence the person appears. From this vaster, truer perspective, you don't have to wait for your soul to unravel all of its karma before freedom is possible, or wait another 1,000 incarnations before you can know the truth. Because what you are isn't gradually becoming free. It's free right here and now. And what obscures that freedom isn't time, it's mistaken identity. As soon as that mistaken identification is dissolved, it's recognized that what we are was never on the wheel of birth and death in the first place. The body, the mind, the so-called life may all continue. The apparent individual may continue to function. but it's no longer taken to be what you fundamentally are. So then the real purpose of spiritual practice isn't personal evolution, but rather personal dissolution, by which I mean the dissolution of the mistaken belief that you're a separate person or even a separate soul. And in the falling away of that false identity, you come to know you have never traveled anywhere. The apparent journey belongs to the jīva. So it's not that we eventually unite with the self, but rather that we recognize that we've never been anything else.